raise your hand, one of the ushers will get you one. Jimmy needs a lesson sheet, Mark. Jimmy said he needed a lot of things, but lesson sheets right now. All right, good to have you. We are almost through with 1 Samuel. Been there a year. Well, you know, every other week and 26 chapters, that's about a year, right? Anyway, so quick review. We won't spend a lot of time on review tonight. Last time, 2 weeks ago, chapter 25, an incredible story. If you're not here, be sure and go home and read chapter 25. The lessons have been posted on Ray Hope Church YouTube channel, so if you wanted to listen to the lesson we gave, you can do that. But three take-homes, which are really, really good. There on your lesson sheet, the take-home lessons were, the first one was, stuff doesn't bring happiness. You know, here we had Nabal, this man who, if you added up everything he had, was probably one of the richest men in the Old Testament. You know, Solomon was probably number 1, Job number 2, and he might have been number 3 or 4. But was he happy? No, it says he was mean, he was selfish, he was miserable, he was cruel. It says he was a fool. You know, it's the lie of the enemy that stuff will make you happy. Because you buy something because you think it's going to make you happy, you dream about it, you save up for it, you buy it, and then it really doesn't bring you the happiness. And you know, what it is as humans, we have this, some people have described it as a God hole, that we try to fill up the God hole in us with stuff of this world, and it never really works. So that's the first lesson, is don't buy the lie of the enemy. It made me think about 15 years ago, Kathy and I went with the mission team down to Mexico. We crossed the border at El Paso. A bunch of teens were with us. And of course, we went to an area of Juarez that was just extraordinarily poor, and spent a week there. And at the end of the week, every teen that was with us gave away everything he brought except the shirt and the pants that were on there that he had on. And I remember about a week later, when the teens gave their testimony about the trip. One of them said, I'll never forget this, I forget exactly who said it, but they said, before I went on that trip, all I thought about was what I didn't have. He said, now I see that those kids were happier than I was, and they had nothing. So now I'm so grateful for the things that I do have. Okay, so number 2, Abigail, who was the star of the show, not David. Abigail cared enough to confront. And that's a critical lesson for us as Christians. You know, David, here, this chapter before, he had just forgiven Saul for chasing him for years, trying to kill him. And here in this chapter, he kind of gets off track because Nabal just refuses to feed he and his men one meal, and he says, put on your swords, men, we're going to go kill Nabal and all his family. And Abigail hears about it and she stops it. But she approaches him in a very honoring, very loving way to confront him. She cared enough to confront, knowing that he was the anointed as the next king, and she did not want him to ruin his reputation with blood guilt. And the way she did it was just so amazing. And then I gave you a resource. If you have a person in your life that you need to caringly confront, I think Buddy told me he was going to get this book. It's a book I read about 25 years ago. It's called Care Enough to Confront. It's a biblical-based book by David Augsburger, Care Enough to Confront. And the third lesson was be unoffendable. About 10 or 15 years ago, Jerry Seinfeld came to Oklahoma City, and we went to see him. But before that show, they actually had an interview that was, back then, people still took newspapers, or some people did. I read that interview, and one of the questions that was asked him was, why don't you go to college campuses anymore? He says, very simple. He said, we live in a culture where everybody's looking to be offended. They're wearing their feelings on their shirt, and they're just looking for somebody to say something that will offend them. He said, humor is basically, it's very easy to offend people with humor. And if people are looking to be offended, I'm going to offend them. He said, I got booed too many times. I'm not going back. So we live in a culture where it's so easy to be offended, but if you look at the life of Jesus, Jesus had hundreds of opportunities to be offended, and he never was. And the verse we gave last week was in John 2:25. It says he knew what was in man. So he just knew that people can be pretty nasty sometimes. People can do things that potentially could offend you, but you've got to know what is in man. There's a sinful nature in man. And if we're to be like Jesus, if we're to be his representatives, his disciples, we should be unoffendable. Abigail put it this way. I thought this was great. I mean, this is I think the big reason that she's the star of the last chapter. She tells David this. She said, "Your purpose, David, is to fight the Lord's battles, not your battles." David was trying to, get Nabal back for not feeding him a meal, so that was his battle. But she says, David, you have a much higher calling. You have the Lord's battles to fight. You're going to be the king. And so in our lives, let's not be offended and fight our little battles. Let's concentrate on the big battle, which is the Lord's battle. That's, we're the Lord's army. So the little saying that we put with that was act, not react. In other words, don't be reactionary against everything that people say or do that kind of turns you the wrong way. Instead, concentrate on acting and doing things for the Lord's kingdom in the world around you and the people that are around you that you can influence. So act, don't react, be unoffendable. Three great lessons from a really, really great chapter in the Bible. I encourage you to go back and read that. Okay, so tonight, you may have wondered about the title of the lesson, The Imagination of Faith. I've never heard that before until I was studying for this lesson, and one of the commentators I used that phrase, and it took me back, and I thought, now, I don't know what he's talking about. So as he went on to explain that, it actually became very clear that what we're going to talk about tonight explains how faith leads to hope. How faith leads to hope. So we could start off by saying that faith gives you the ability to imagine a better future, and that's what gives you hope. So faith gives you the ability to imagine a better future, and that's what gives you hope. So here's some examples. So when you were a child, a small child, whoever was raising you, whether it's parent, grandparent, uncle, aunt, foster parent, you depended on them for every need. So when you were hungry, if you had faith in this person that was raising you because they were good to you and they provided for you, when you were hungry, you can imagine the next meal coming. So that gave you hope that your hunger was going to be taken care of. If you needed clothes, you could imagine that they were going to provide those clothes for you, so that gave you hope that your clothing would be taken care of. When Christmas time came and you had faith that they were going to give you presents that you wanted, and so when they saw the box under the tree, you can imagine what's in that box, and that gave you the hope that your wishes would come true. So, as Christians, faith-based imagination helps us maintain hope in difficult times. So, if we're having difficulty with our health, difficulty with finances, difficulty in our marriage, with family, with friends, if we can visualize and imagine better times, that helps give us strength to persevere through the challenge. Now, as we go through this lesson tonight, and really when you read Psalms, you're going to see this over and over and over. David had a great imagination that sprang from his faith that gave him the hope to keep going when Saul was chasing him for all these years trying to kill him. Okay, let's start the lesson. We're going through chapter 26 tonight. Now some men from Ziph came to Saul at Gibeah to tell him, David is hiding on the hill of Hachilah, which overlooks Jessamon. So Saul took 3,000 of Israelites' elite troops and went to hunt him down in the wilderness of Ziph. Saul camped along the road along the hill of Hachilah near Jessamon, where David was hiding. When David learned that Saul had come after him into the wilderness, he sent out spies to verify the report of Saul's arrival. Okay, bring up the map. Okay, so the last few chapters, David has been in the south side of Judah. So over to the right is the Dead Sea, where the little red dot is Hachilah, the hill of Hachilah, and then just to the left of that is Ziph. So he's actually been there before. He went south, and then he now has come back to this same area. Now, what we see in this chapter, and the verses we just read, is that for the second time, these Ziphites betray David. He comes back in the area, and they let Saul know, or let Saul's spies know, that he is back in the area. Now, we've talked in the past about how the people in this area were descendants of Caleb, but Caleb lived 500 or 600 years previously. They're part of the tribe of Judah. David's part of the tribe of Judah. See, Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin. And even today we are tribal, and back then they were tribal, so you tend to be loyal to the people from your tribe. But for some reason the people of Ziph were more loyal to Saul, who was a Benjamite, than they were to David, who was a Judahite, just like they were. Now, there's got to be two reasons. I mean, I thought of two reasons. Why would they be more loyal to Saul? Number one, Saul's the sitting king. He's the one in power. So, you want to have good graces from the guy that's got all the power. Second thing is, if you remember, Saul had killed all the priests in Nob and a lot of the people and their families in Nob just because he thought they had helped David. That was several chapters back. And so I think probably the bigger reason here is the Ziphites were afraid of Saul. They knew he was capable of really crazy, crazy things. And so they were willing to give up David to win Saul's favor. Anyway, so Saul and his 3,000 chosen troops camp on this hill of Hachilah where that red dot is. And David is in the wilderness near there with his 600 men. So it's 3,000 to 600. That's the odds. And I'm sure they both have spies that are telling him where the other one is. Now, what is David thinking? Once more the Ziphites have betrayed him. Once more Saul and his 3,000 chosen soldiers are hot on his heels. Well, let's read Psalms 54. We've said that the Psalms, a lot of the Psalms, not all of them were written by David, but a whole lot of them were. They serve kind of as his journal. Some people journal their thoughts and their experiences day by day, and a whole lot of the Psalms have headings that tell you when they were written, what David was doing. And so the heading of Psalm 54 says, when the Ziphites told Saul that David was hiding among them. So this is what he writes at this time in the story. So let's read that, Psalms 54, 1 through 5. Now I want you to notice the imagination that comes from his faith. Come with great power, O God, and rescue me. Defend me with your might. Listen to my prayer. Pay attention to my plea, for strangers are attacking me. Violent people are trying to kill me. They care nothing for God. But God is my helper. The Lord keeps me alive. May the evil plans of my enemies be turned against them. Do as you promised and put an end to them. So because of David's faith in God, he's imagining that God will take care of him, will take care of his enemies, will defend him, will keep him alive. And so that is giving him hope. So David then decides on a very daring plan. So he's going to take 2 of his leaders to personally spy on Paul's camp one evening. Let's read 26:5. David slipped over to Saul's camp one night to look around. Saul and Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, were sleeping inside a ring formed by these slumbering warriors. So we're talking about a pretty large camp. You've got 3,000 people in a big circle, and in the very middle is Saul and his general Abner. And Abner is the cousin of Saul. Okay, verse 6. Who will volunteer to go in there with me? David asked Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai, son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother. I'll go with you, Abishai replied. So we learn that David's taken 2 men with him to go look down on Saul's camp, and he asked, which of you 2 will go with me? And Abishai says, I'll go with you. So who are these people? Let's kind of look and see who these people are. So we have Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, brother of Joab. Now, if you go back to chapter 16, when David was anointed as the next king, we learned that his father Jesse had 8 sons. David was the youngest of 8 sons. Now, this is the very first mention in Samuel of Zeruiah, but later she's mentioned several times. It is his older sister. We don't know exactly how much older she was than him, but we do learn from the scriptures that she has 3 sons, and they must be about the same age as David, so she's probably one of the oldest children in the family. And so 2 of her sons are Joab and Abishai. So they are actually David's nephews, but they're probably close to his age. So they become very important people to David, not just now, but actually throughout his kingdom. Joab actually becomes his general and stays his general throughout his entire reign. So he's like the second in command under David for the entire reign of David. And then once Solomon becomes king, Joab passes away. He's older then. So Abishai is Joab's brother. So Joab and Abishai are 2 of the sons of Zeruiah, David's oldest sister. And so we assume they came to him in chapter 22. Remember, in the cave of Adullam, David had gone there, and the first people that came to him were his family. And so we assume that is when his brothers came, and probably his sister, and here his nephew, so all his family came to him. So we believe that's when they joined him in this wilderness wandering, so to speak. And so Joab becomes his general, because as we know, after that, for over some period of time, 400 men that were broken joined broken David in the cave of Adullam. And now it's even grown to 600 at this point in the lesson. So we have an army of 600. So Joab is his general. And so these other 2 men, Abishai and Ahimelech, are either spies or lieutenants, but they have some sort of leadership capacity. So David takes them with him. So we assume that Joab is back in charge of the troops. And he's looking over the camp of Saul, and there's 3,000 men, and Saul and Abner are in the middle. Now, Ahimelech the Hittite, he obviously had to be one of those 400 broken men that came in to join David in the cave. So David says, I'm going to go down there. I'm going to go down to where Saul is. Which of you will go with me? Abishai says, I will. Because it's interesting, if you think about this, we've read all these Psalms that David writes during this period of time. We've seen all these providential things that God does to save him, protect him. So David is not worried about going into this camp of 3,000 of the enemy. And so he asked the other 2, who will go with me? Now, see, they have witnessed the same thing that David's witnessed. They have witnessed God's protection of David for all these years, 7 or 8 years probably by now. And so they should have the same level of faith. And so Abishai steps up and says, I'll go with you. I'll go with you. Verse 7. So David and Abishai went right into Saul's camp and found him asleep, with his spear struck in the ground beside his head. Abner and the soldiers were lying asleep around him. So they sneak into the camp. They go down right to the middle. They find his spear stuck in the ground. His general Abner is next to him sleeping, and the 3,000 are around. Now it'll explain a few verses later. Unbeknownst to David, what's happening here, you think, well, how in the world could not one person in that 3,000 know that somebody's sneaking in the camp? We're going to learn a few verses later that God is helping out David again. It's going to say in verse 12 that God caused a deep sleep to come over all of Saul's camp. So David doesn't know this. How many times in your life, of course we don't know, you don't know what you don't know, but how many times in your life have things gone well when maybe they shouldn't have, and perhaps God did something to make that work for you? You know, that's one of the things I think about getting to heaven and asking God lots of questions. I guess I had to get in line. There'd be quite a few folks there. Tell me all the times you had my back that I had no clue. I think, well, you know, there's sometimes we know that he does, and that's what we give testimonies about. But I think there's probably hundreds more times that we have no clue how God has spared us, how God has saved us, how God has helped us, how God has smoothed the way, how he's removed open doors, how he's closed doors. And we just think, oh, I'm lucky, or it just happened to be right. Don't you think that? So here David is in the camp. Of course, he's full of faith that it's all going to work out. But once more, God is behind the scenes making sure everybody's dead asleep. Anyway, so Saul's spear is kind of like the king's robe. You know, 2 chapters ago, similar situation where David could have killed Saul. Saul went to sleep in the cave where David was hiding, and had his robe, that kingly, we talked about the kingly robe was a symbol of his authority. It was the same thing with the spear. Back then, a king's spear wasn't just a spear they grabbed off the wall like everybody else. They had a very certain spear that was decorated to show that it was the king's spear. Okay, show the image of the king's spearhead that we see. This is, of course, this is not Saul's. This is actually, from archaeology, a copper spearhead from Lugal, the king of Kish, actually from a little bit time before Saul. But it's just, this thing is about 18 inches long. It's hard to see that from that picture, but it's just, I'm just saying, Saul's spear was a kingly spear that showed his authority. So here we have David. Think about this. Here's Saul asleep, here's Abner asleep, here's the spear stuck in the ground. David is looking at the spear that Saul almost killed him with several times. You know, remember when years back now, when David was still in the court and he was playing the lyre for Saul to try to soothe his mental anguish, and Saul would just pick up his spear and hurl it at David, and you know, several times he just barely missed him. So now he's looking at the spear and thinking, you know, I could have been killed by that spear. Okay, verse 8, 9, and 10. Sure, God has surely, now this is Abishai whispering to David, okay? Surely God has handed your enemy over to you this time. Abishai whispered to David, let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't need to strike twice. No, David said, don't kill him, for who can remain innocent after attacking the Lord's anointed one? Surely the Lord will strike Saul down someday, or he will die of old age or in battle. What's that? The imagination of David that he got from his faith. That God's going to take care of this, so I can imagine all the ways that God can do it. He may die in battle, he may die of old age, God may strike him down sometime, but I'm not going to do it. So that's the imagination that gives hope to David that yes, Saul will die and he will become king. So once more, and it's just kind of like in the cave. You remember all the men said, David, David, they're all asleep. God has providentially given you an opportunity to kill Saul and get this over with. We've been running from him for years. So here Abishai says, God's given you into his hand. But Abishai knew David wouldn't do it himself because, not long ago in the cave, David refused to do it. So Abishai says, I'll do it myself. I'll take care of this for you. I'll take care of this. You won't have to do it, David. It'll all fall on me. David says, no, he is still the Lord's anointed. You can't kill Saul and be guiltless. And then he gave the saying about his imagination of faith that God is going to take care of Saul for us. We don't have to do it. Okay, verse 11 and 12. The Lord forbid that I should kill the one he has anointed, but take his spear and that jug of water beside his head, then let's go get out of here. So David took the spear and the jug of water that were near Saul's head. Then he and Abishai got away without anyone seeing them or even waking up, because the Lord had put Saul's men into a deep sleep. So here we learn the secret to the success of the mission. Okay, verse 13 and 16. David climbed the hill opposite the camp until he was at a safe distance. Then he shouted down to the soldiers and to Abner, son of Ner, "Wake up, Abner," Saul's general. "Who is it?" Abner demanded. "Well, Abner, you're a great man, aren't you?" David said. "Where in all Israel is there anyone as mighty? So why haven't you guarded your master the king when someone came to kill him? This isn't good at all. I swear by the Lord that you and your men deserve to die because you failed to protect your master, the Lord's anointed. Look around. Where are the king's spear and the jug of water that were beside his head?" Wow. So he calls down to Abner, the general, and said, basically, Abner, you deserve to die. You didn't protect your king. Verse 17. Saul recognized David's voice, and he called out, "Is that you, my son David?" David replied, "Yes, my lord the king." So now Saul wakes up. This is kind of like, again, 2 chapters ago at the cave in En-Gedi. He says the same thing. "David, my son, is that you?" Now, notice David answers differently this time. He says, "Yes, my lord, O king," but this time he didn't say, "my father." Two chapters ago he said, "my father." Now, why would he say "my father"? Remember, after he killed Goliath, one of the rewards for killing Goliath was he got to marry one of the king's daughters. He got to marry Michal. So Saul was actually his father-in-law. So all these years, Saul had been chasing his own son-in-law. Well, David had to leave Michal behind to run from Saul, so now he's been away from her for some time. And we find out that Saul actually gives her to a different man between the cave of Adullam and here. We're going to backtrack to a verse we did not read last time, which is sort of a postscript to the lesson last time. Verse 25, there at the bottom of your lesson sheet on the right column. Chapter 25, 43 and 44. This is right at the end of the story about Nabal, David, and Abigail. David also married, at the end of that story, remember, David was going to take Abigail as a wife because Nabal had died. David also married Ahinoam from Jezreel, making both of them, referring to Abigail and Ahinoam, his wives. Meanwhile, Saul had given his daughter Michal, David's wife, to another man from Gallim named Palti, son of Laish. So obviously David has heard about this. So in our lesson tonight, he knows that he no longer has Michal as a wife. She's been given to another man, so he does not call Saul his father. And I'm sure Saul notices the difference. Okay, verse 43 and let's see here, 43 and 44. No, I'm sorry. Second sheet, or on the back of your sheet, chapter 26, 18 through 20. So why are you chasing me? This is David talking to Saul. Very similar speech to what he gave after the cave of Adullam. So why are you chasing me? What have I done? What is my crime? But now let my Lord the king listen to his servant. If the Lord has stirred you up against me, then let him accept my offering. But if this is simply a human scheme, then may those be involved be cursed by the Lord. For they've driven me from my home, so I can no longer live among the Lord's people. And they have said, go worship pagan gods. Must I die on foreign soil, far from the presence of the Lord? Why has the king of Israel come out to search for a single flea? Why does he hunt me down like a partridge on the mountains? So like I said, it's a very similar speech to what David gave at the cave in Gedi as he was calling out to Saul after Saul had gotten up from his rest and left. And David's letting Saul know then that he could have killed him then because he cut off a piece of his robe. But David kind of makes 5 points in this little speech. Let's go over those 5 points. First of all, he continues to show respect for the office of the king. He doesn't respect Saul as a person, but he shows respect for the office of the king. He says, my Lord, my king, and he refers to himself as a servant. So in spite of who's in the office, he still respects the office. And we should do the same thing. Number 2, David repeats, I have done no evil, so why are you chasing me? And then he says, if I've done something wrong, tell it to me. I'll bring a sin offering so that you don't have to chase me anymore because I've done something wrong. Obviously, he hadn't, but he's trying to get Saul to understand that there's no reason for Saul to be chasing him. Then number 3, he talks about the same thing he did back at the speech of the cave. He said, if you got some evil advisors that are telling you to kill me, they're the ones that are doing wrong. Don't listen to people that are telling you the wrong thing because I've done nothing wrong. And the 4th thing, this is interesting, when he says, they've said, go worship pagan gods. What he's saying here, David's saying, I'm on the run. I can't really get out in public in Israel. I can't go to the temple or the tabernacle. It was still the tabernacle then. I can't go to the tabernacle and worship. I can't go to the places in public worship. And I miss that. I like to do that. Instead, it's like, because you're chasing me, if I want to go to a temple, I've got to go to a pagan temple. But I'm not going to do that. So he's saying, I love public worship, and I'm not getting to do that. I haven't got to do that for 7 or 8 years. Made me think about all the places in the world that Christians are persecuted right now. And that's what they have to do. They have to hide and meet together in houses. They can't really have a big public worship because it's against the law. They can be killed. And many of them are. So we're so blessed that we can do this without fear of retaliation. And, if you've ever been sick or away for a long time, you miss this gathering. I miss this gathering if I've ever been away for a time. I can't wait to get back and be with the people I know and love and worship God together and praise God together and study together. I mean, it's such a blessing. And David is missing that. And he's telling Saul that I miss that. I miss that. I look forward to doing that again sometime. And then the 5th thing, he said, King, you have 3,000 of the best soldiers. So he's implicating, like he did at the cave in Gedi, think how much of the king's treasury you're using to chase a single flea. He said, think of the quartermaster's duty of feeding 3,000 men every day, how much that takes. And so you're chasing a single flea or a partridge. Back in chapter 24, he said you're chasing a flea or a dog. But he's trying to say, it's not worth it. What you're doing is not worth it. You don't need to be chasing me. Of course, we all know what a flea is. But, the only thing I'd ever heard of partridge about the partridge in a pear tree. So I thought, well, let's just look at a partridge. There's a partridge. We don't have any partridges in America. but apparently in the old world, in the Mediterranean, also Europe, partridges are very, very common. But they're kind of like quail. They're mostly ground living birds. If they feel threatened, they'll fly up into a tree, but they don't just fly around very much. But they're just very, very common. And so he's saying, Saul, why are you chasing a partridge? In other words, it's like, it's not worth anything. It's just not worth it. We might say a sparrow. We might say, Jesus talked about the sparrow. So in our culture in America, we might say, Saul, why are you chasing a single sparrow? It's just not worth it. Okay, verse 21. Then Saul confessed, I have sinned. Have we heard this before? Several times, right? Oh, Saul, I have sinned. Come back home, my son, and I will no longer try to harm you. For you valued my life today. I have been a fool, and I am very, very wrong. Wow. We've heard the same thing over and over and over. Do you know anybody that's always sorry but never changes? Verse 22, here's your spear, O king, David replied. Let one of your young men come over and get it. In other words, I am not coming down there. I know you better than you know yourself. One of the sayings of Confucius, and I don't know that Confucius ever said anything, but we have all these Confucius sayings, but one of my favorite ones is, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. In other words, you can fool me one time, but if I'm going to believe you every time you say something, shame on me. And so that's what David is saying here. Shame on me if I listen to this sad song one more time and really believe that you're going to change, that your heart really has changed. Okay, verse 23 and 24. The Lord gives his own reward for doing good and for being loyal, and I refuse to kill you even when the Lord placed you in my power. For you are the Lord's anointed one. Now may the Lord value my life, even as I have valued yours today. May he rescue me from all my troubles. What's that? That's that imagination of faith again. He's saying, because I believe in God, that faith gives me the ability to imagine that he's going to rescue me from all my troubles, so that gives me hope. Okay, verse 25. And Saul said to David, blessings on you, my son David. You will do many heroic deeds, and you surely will succeed. Well, for once, Saul said something that was true. Then David went away, and Saul returned home. Those are the last recorded words of Saul and David to each other. They never see each other again that we know of. Saul acknowledges that David will be the next king and be a great king, and they part ways. Saul ultimately to disgrace and death, and David to victory and glory. Okay, so let's look at the lesson, and let's kind of talk about this just a little bit. We live in I call this waiting patiently on God number 2, because the lesson in chapter 24 was waiting patiently on God when he had the opportunity to kill Saul in the cave of En-Gedi, and yet he chose not to. He didn't want to get ahead of God and kind of do a short run around and make God's wishes come true before God was ready for them to do that. So, both times, 24 and 26, both chapters, his men believed that God providentially provided this opportunity for David to kill Saul. But both times David said, I will not kill God's anointed. We're going to wait on God. God will do this in his own time. So we must wait. And that's hard for us. Waiting on God is so hard for us. We live in a very, very impatient world. microwaves, instant this, fast food. We get upset if we have to wait for fast food for 5 minutes. It'd take you a lot longer than that to cook it at home, but we're just very impatient. To give you an idea how things have changed in 1 year, in 100 years, put the picture of that stove up there. Okay, this is a kitchen stove. This was the most popular brand of kitchen stove in America 100 years ago, towards the beginning of the 1900s. To cook on that stove, it had a wood box. So you'd have to start a fire, let the fire get hot, and then you'd put your pans on the top. The brand of that stove, the most popular brand in America, was called Quick Meal. Amazing, huh? That was a microwave 100 years ago. And can you imagine us today cooking on a quick meal stove and being happy about it? Anyway, just to kind of show you how things have changed. Anyway, so back in chapter, so talking about waiting patiently on God, we got some good principles from the chapter 24, the psalm that David wrote in that cave at that time. We looked at that, and that psalm kind of gave us some insights into his thinking about waiting on God. I'm just going to quick review those. Those are there on your lesson sheet. Number one, he believed in the sovereignty of God. He believed that God was in charge of his life. God was large and in charge. So he didn't need to help God out. He didn't need to find a shortcut to speed up God's purpose for his life. So when we're trying to wait on God, we need to realize God has our life in his hands. Isaiah says God has our names on the palm of his hand. And we don't need to try to help God out and speed things up just because we are impatient. And that's very, very hard to do. But we need to just sit back and be more like David and say, I'm going to let God do this as he sees fit. The second thing he said in Psalm 57, he believed in God's faithfulness to him. So David believed that God was faithful to him, so David could believe in his promises. So if God had promised him that he would be the next king, he just had to sit back and let God make it happen when it was God's timing. So we have got to believe in God's faithfulness to us as his children. And that will help us know that he knows what's best for us. He knows the best timing. He knows the best way. Number three that we saw from Psalm 57, David was selfless. So it wasn't all about me. Sometimes we get to thinking or start acting like, what's important to me is what's most important, and that's not true. We are servants of the king. And when you're a servant to a king, the king's wishes are more important than your wishes. You live to serve the king. You don't live to serve yourself. So David was willing to suffer hardship because he knew that God's glory and God's purposes were more important than what he wanted. It was not about him. So it's not about us. Number four we got from Psalm 54 on waiting on God. David was confident in God so he could be faithful to God. So since he was confident in God's faithfulness to him, that made him faithful towards God because he had someone he could fully trust in. And he knew that if I put my faith in God, let him be in charge, not try to cut a shortcut, not try to get glory for myself, then I'm doing what I need to be doing. And then I can patiently wait on God. So that was the 4 lessons we got from chapter 24. And so in chapter 26, we want to add one to that. And that is this imagination that comes from faith that gives us hope. And when you have hope, it makes you able to more patiently wait on God. So chapter 26, verse 10 was the first time we read in this chapter about David expressing the imagination that came from his faith. He says, surely the Lord will strike Saul down someday, or he'll die of old age, or he'll die in battle. And so we're seeing here that David has this great faith, and that allows him to imagine a better future when he's not having a good time right now. He's imagining that God's going to make this all right. So I've written a lot of these comments there on your lesson sheet so that you can review them later, but a deep, life-changing faith gives us, when we're in difficult circumstances, the ability to imagine positive future outcomes as a result of God's love and providence for us. The imagination of faith is what gives us hope. This hope sustains us in challenging times. We can visualize a better future or a higher purpose, and in doing so, we find strength to persevere in the present difficulty. We saw this with Jonathan back a few chapters back, I think it's chapter 14. Dear friend of David, but he was the crown prince. He was the oldest son of Saul. And in chapter 14, he took a few of his men, and they were going to attack a Philistine outpost. And he expresses this same imagination of faith there in 14:6 there on your lesson sheet. Jonathan said to his armor bearer, perhaps the Lord will help us, for nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few. So you see what it is? He got such great faith in God that he's imagining what can happen, because God is sovereign, God is in charge, God has a purpose. We're going to sit back and wait on God patiently and see what he does. And what's amazing is often he does things that are much greater than what we can ever imagine. So, as children, we have a great imagination of what we can do. Bring up the picture of the little boy. So this little boy, about 5 or 6, that's got a cowboy hat on and a couple of 6-shooters. So let me tell you, when we're children, we imagine ourselves as kind of like superheroes. I mean, you can beat the world. I was going to tell you a story. I don't have an actual picture of my son Ty, but this is about the age he was. We were getting ready to leave to go to our 3rd trip to Nigeria, to serve in Nigeria. And Ty was, I think, about 4 or 5 at the time. And this is long before these tight airport security. And actually what brought on all this tight airport security, there was a whole lot of hijackings of international flights back at that time. And so anytime you're getting around an international flight, you couldn't help but think about it and talk about it. Anyway, so we're getting ready to leave the house to get in the car to drive the DFW to get on the plane to fly overseas. And Ty comes out with his 6-shooters on and his hat. And we asked him, we're going on a plane, what do you have that on for? He said, I'm ready for the hijackers. I'm going to get the hijackers. So he's going to take care of this. He's going to take care of anybody who's going to hijack that plane. Anyway, that's the imagination of a child, right? But see, what happens as we grow older, that imagination, that wonderful imagination of children, gives way to reality. And what happens is there's a reality in life that things happen, circumstances happen that are not good, that we can't fix. I can't do something to change this. I don't like it. It's uncomfortable. It's horrible. It's heartbreaking. But I can't fix it. And that's when we have to lean on God. But we wanted to hurry up and do it now. But we've got to learn patience, to wait patiently on God. So when we have that faith that He will do that He will, because He loves us, because He is sovereign, because He does have faithfulness towards us, because it's not about us, it's about Him, and He has a purpose for our lives, we can wait patiently for Him, and that faith can give us the imagination which leads to the hope that He's going to take care of it, which helps us wait patiently for Him. So it works in these ways. They're on your lesson sheet. We can imagine our present difficulties can change for the better. We can hope for divine intervention in seemingly hopeless situations, which gives us comfort and strength to keep going. We can imagine ourselves as stronger and wiser disciples, giving us the motivation to grow and to have greater influence on others. And we can imagine a future heaven of wholeness, peace, and harmony. In other words, God's not going to fix everything that happens to us in our lives. And we're wrong if we think that that's a wrong faith. But we all can have the hope. We can have the imagination of the hope of heaven where there's wholeness, where we will have peace, where we will have harmony with all people, where we'll be believers with believers of all ages, glorifying God. So that's the lesson about how when you have deep faith, that gives us an imagination of how God can work, and that leads us to having hope. And because of that hope, then we can patiently wait for Him. As I studied this, I thought about, man, I feel sorry for folks that don't have faith. Because if you don't have faith, you can't imagine something better, so you can't have hope. How would you like to live without any hope? I wouldn't. And I can't imagine that anyone is satisfied to live in this world without hope. And I can't explain it. I can't get into anyone's head that I don't understand that. But our job is to live as servants of the King. And one of the ways we do that, where we show light in a dark world, salt in a decaying world, is to be patient when things are not going right. And people see that we're patient and not impatient. They're saying, how can you do that? You say, because I have faith in God. I can imagine how He's going to fix this or carry me to a better place. So it gives me hope. And I have hope. Do you have hope? That can be our testimony. Anyway, that's our lesson tonight. Thank you. Let's stand and we'll give thanks. Father, thank you so much. Oh God, thank you. Thank you that we can depend on you. We know that you are our sovereign God, our sovereign King, that this life is about you. It's not about us. That you are faithful to us. So we can be faithful to you. So we can wait patiently on you. But through that faith, we can have great imagination of how you will take care of us. And that gives us the living hope that we have. Thank you, God. We pray this through your Son, Jesus. Amen.